So without further ado, Kim, could you give us the fish community's assessment of this?
I will, thank you. And Milton, you're a very hard act to follow. No thank you to you. And that was the longest 8 minutes of my life. I promise the next 8 minutes will be about 8 minutes. So I am a marine scientist by background, and I've been affiliated with UCSB for many years, but about 4 years ago now, I took a position as the executive director of our Commercial Fishing Association here in town, Commercial Fishermen of Santa Barbara, which is a 501c3 nonprofit with an educational mission. And I feel very proud to be in that capacity and grateful for it. I've learned so much, and I feel very confident that I can represent our fishing community and advocate for them as a marine scientist and as an environmentalist of sorts, because our fisheries are very sustainable, and our fishermen are always working on ways to make their fisheries more sustainable, working within the regulations, following the rules, and have had to adapt to a lot of changes over the last few years. At the moment, we have about 200 fishermen using our port every year, and we're bringing in about 4 to 7 million pounds of seafood across our docks. Over 100 species are sold commercially from our docks. It's one of the most diverse ports in the country, and that's a real asset to us. Creates resilience as the climate changes and fluctuates. We always have something that's booming. And that amount of catch generates about $11 to $14 million of revenue to the fishermen off the docks, and that then generates about $35 million to our community just in the fishing industry's sort of indirect effects through the seafood industry. And so this is not a small industry, it's an important one, and it creates food security for our community. It creates a very healthy food source with low food miles. And when the Refugio oil spill happened, the seafood industry and the fishing industry was hurt pretty badly. A lot of people thought the entire channel was polluted and would not buy our seafood. The fishermen lost a lot of revenue. They were also excluded from a very large area. And actually that's something that really changed my life, because Plains All-American gave a grant to the Chamber of Commerce in Santa Barbara to create a position that would help to give the fishing industry a little bit of help with the PR and getting people to understand that the seafood is safe here and make up for those losses, and that was me. And so that's what brought me here. So I came with a little bit of oil money. We're being very transparent here today. That funded my first 2 years with the Fishing Association. I had no contact with Plains whatsoever, and it was a one-time thing. And since then, a lot of my funding for my executive director position has come from the Nature Conservancy, so kind of at the other end of the spectrum. And we collaborate on a lot of different research projects to improve fisheries and fisheries management with the Nature Conservancy. And so it's a kind of, there's no kind of straight black and white situation, and that's the case for the oil rigs with our fishing community as well. They're a mixed bag, and I'm going to start with many of the negatives that they've created for our fishing community, namely that they've taken away fishing grounds. For our net fishermen, they have to give those rigs a huge berth so that they don't risk tangling their nets on the rigs up to 2 miles or more. They have to avoid, and that a lot of those rigs are in prime fishing grounds, and they've lost that area with no mitigation money, as is often done in other cases. These rigs can be extremely dangerous if you do end up catching your net on them. They can sink your boat if you're going at a good clip. And they also have negatives because of the perception that oil is being coming out of our channel with a lot of contaminants, and people worry about the contamination of the seafood. We've heard from Milton that there's no evidence that that has a net effect on our seafood, which is good. They've also provided these fishery enhancements, perhaps, to some of our species, but perhaps for some of them they've been aggregators into places where we can't reach those fish. So that sort of cancels each other out, and it's not really clear. No one's studied that in great enough depth from a fisheries perspective to really know the answer there. But they've had some positive effects in terms of being economic opportunities. For many years, there was an aquaculture, or not an aquaculture, sorry, a mussel harvesting operation called Ecomar that was harvesting mussels off of our rigs. There are many beautiful mussels and scallops down there that grow quite large. There's interest in trying to do that again. Recently, one of the oil companies was cleaning the jacket, scraping everything off, and it was a real shame that all of that just sank to the seafloor, even though there's a lot of really economically viable and healthy seafood that could have been taken off of there. Now, the federal government has no way, or kind of no pathway to establish the testing of that shellfish to make sure it's safe for human consumption at this moment. But that's something that can be changed, and we've talked to Blue Latitudes about that. That's a possibility in the future of sustainable shellfish harvest off of these rigs with sufficient testing to make sure they're safe for human consumption. And so there's other economic opportunities as well that these structures present to aquaculture opportunities with potentially growing seaweeds and abalone, for instance, which is a high-value species that could grow quite well out there. Urchin ranching. Right now, our urchin fishery is in decline because of the warm water and the lack of kelp and the abundance of purple urchin, creating these urchin barrens across the reefs. And the red urchin is the fisheries species. And that is because the red urchin has larger gonads, more eggs to make a product out of than the purple urchin. But if you gathered up all those urchin, put them in a big bag, and you hung them off somewhere, like an oil rig or some other structure out in a high flow area, gave them some kelp, you could fatten them up, and you could bring them to market. And that's something that's already started and is also a potential component of kelp forest restoration, to bring all of these purple urchins off the reef, let the kelp regrow. And if we have an economically viable market for these purple urchin, that would create an economic opportunity instead of just a restoration conservation project. So these are some of the things that have been tossed around by our fishing community. The fishermen in our port don't all agree on what should be done with these rigs. There's some that are very set on full removal, return to full access to fishing grounds with full removal of the shell mounds and other potentially contaminated soils. And there are some that feel that keeping them in the water with the actual platform intact would be the best option, because you have that economic opportunity and they're already there and they see kind of a broader picture. Now, the idea of cutting them off at 80 to 100 feet under the water is the least popular with the fishermen, because they really do present hazards to fishing. Even though there's, of course, the plan to attach buoys and moorings to these things so that you see them out there, they're not always easy to see, and these moorings can break loose. There's a history of that happening in other decommissioned platforms that still have material in the water, and that becomes a real hazard to fishing boats. And so the guys who are trawling and using nets around these rigs, by and large, that I've talked to, really would prefer that they come completely out, or we leave some sort of platform there. Now, every rig is different, and some areas are not in high fishing areas, and so what we feel is it really is a case-by-case determination of what we can do with each rig that makes sense and balances out for everyone's needs, including the fishing industry. And I would mention something that hasn't come up from the panel yet, which is that there's a potential huge cost savings of hundreds of millions of dollars that the oil companies will save if they leave these structures partially in the water. And that has been talked about in terms of creating a fund that the state of California would receive at least 50% of that cost savings, or maybe more. And that's a lot of money. It could be up to $500 million. And as citizens of Santa Barbara that have kind of had to deal with the pros and cons of these oil rigs for so many years, it makes sense to me that we would try to make sure some of that money, if that fund were to be set up and there was some savings from this Rigs to Reef program, that we would try to get that money back to our community. We could work on sea level rise adaptation, other climate change adaptation with that money. It seems fairly appropriate. But also other places in California that need this. Our coastal communities definitely need more funding to maintain our port infrastructure. Our fisheries are very productive and are sustainable, and yet they're not really getting the economic attention that they need from the state, the budgets. And we would hope that, given that fishermen have been the ones suffering the most from lost fishing grounds, that would be a beneficiary. But I have colleagues who think that that's unrealistic and that the state would distribute these funds in other ways and we wouldn't see much of that money. But I think that, instead of kind of giving up in defeat already, that would be something we'd be interested in working on. So I'll stop there. Thank you.